Scott Drew, Kelvin Sampson, Mike Boynton, and Mark Pope. We'll talk about all those names as they relate to the Louisville men's basketball head coaching search and more on this episode of the Locked On Louisville podcast. Stay tuned.
You are Locked On Louisville, your daily podcast on the Louisville Cardinals. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What's going on, everyone? Welcome in to another episode of the Locked On Louisville podcast. I'm your host, Dalton. I serve as a credentialed media member for Cardinal Sports Zone, and I also do some PA announcement work for the university in various sports. I want to take this time, as always, to thank you personally for making us your first listen of the day. And just a reminder, the Locked On Louisville podcast is free on all streaming services, 5 days a week, your team every day. We'll talk about more possible head coaching candidates on this episode of the show. We will begin with Baylor's Scott Drew and Houston's Kelvin Sampson. We'll then transition into Oklahoma State's Mike Boynton and BYU's Mark Pope, and we'll finish the show out talking a little season outlook for the Louisville softball team that begins their season today down in Boca Raton. Starting out with a little bit of talking about more candidates as it relates to the men's basketball head coaching search. We'll talk about Scott Drew from Baylor, Kelvin Sampson from Houston, two names that have been discussed throughout since since the buyout agreement was announced. Sampson and Drew have been names that have kind of been brought up in conversation as those that are probably not realistic, but ones that you should still check in on. And I agree. I'm a part of the whole insert candidate here say no. I'm a part of that crowd, but I'm here to tell you, Scott Drew and Kelvin Sampson there's almost no chance of either really being the next head coach for the Louisville men's basketball team, and both are for different reasons. We'll start out with Scott Drew. Scott Drew right now, 51 years old. He's making about $3.35 million, has a significant buyout as well, I believe. He has really turned this Baylor program around since joining the program or taking over for the program. The first 3 years they had less than 10 wins, 4 wins in the 05-06 season. Started to turn it around after that slowly but surely, has made the NCAA tournament countless amount of times. Most notably, 2019-20, they were 26-4 and right in line for a 1 seed. Last year they won the whole thing. This year they're 19-4. So, there's a handful of factors as to why Scott Drew is not necessarily a realistic candidate. In fact, he's probably one of the names that you talk about as being an untouchable type of coach. Now, here's the thing. Is Louisville a better job than Baylor? Well, I guess to be able to answer that, I have to really, see where the priorities are in terms of your decision making, because I think that Louisville is more historical. I think it has a more rich history, more success throughout the decades, more national prominence as a whole when you consider the program in terms of the fan base, the facilities, etc. But as of right now, Scott Drew has the Baylor Bears as a powerhouse. And, he's been there for nearly 2 decades. He's, a beloved figure down in Waco, Texas. And it's not necessarily going to work, in terms of, it's not going to be one of those things to where I think if Baylor was struggling in the past handful of years, maybe he looks into it. Maybe he considers it. I think that at the end of the day, when you compare Louisville and you compare Baylor, if the Bears are not a national powerhouse, I think it's not necessarily a debate on which is the better job. And historically, I think Louisville is a top 5 to 8 job in college basketball. But, think about it. It's, they're recruiting at a high level. Scott Drew has had Baylor over the past decade been very respectable. They made the Elite Eight in 2012. They've had some good teams throughout. But these past 3 years, 2019, 2020, They were definitely a national championship contender before COVID, canceled the tournament. They won the whole thing last year, and definitely it was no fluke. They were one of the two best teams in the country. And this season, I mean, they're 19-4. They spent some time as number one in the AP poll at points of this 2021-22 campaign. So at this point in time, it's one of those where it's like, yeah, make Scott Drew say no, but there's not really a ton of consideration. I think Jeff Goodman of Watch Stadium basically came out and said, when he was talking about possible options, Scott Drew would be like, thanks, but no thanks. And I think that that's kind of the vibe that I would get. I think he'd be flattered by the offer, but ultimately there's just so much going on for him at Baylor, the national championship contender seemingly every year. So it really makes no sense for him to truly consider Louisville. On the opposite end of the spectrum, Houston's Kelvin Sampson. He's a little bit older, 66 years old, makes about $3.1 million. In terms of buyout, the way I read it, the buyout would be the remaining contract. The base salary, maybe plus incentives as well. And his contract goes through the end of the 2026-27 season. So his buyouts, pretty significant, pretty hefty, kind of like Nate Oates, so to speak. There's a couple reasons why, Kelvin is not necessarily a realistic candidate either. First of all, I will say he is one hell of a head coach, just like Scott Drew. I think Kelvin Sampson is one of those coaches that does more with less. It's, recruiting wise, I think that it's all about player development at Houston, recruiting to, a program that isn't necessarily, a powerhouse by any stretch of the imagination in the American Athletic. It's one of those things to where it's easier said than done on trying to get guys, big high profile recruits to come to, H-Town to play for the Cougars. But I think that Kelvin Sampson is a great X's and O's coach. He's spent a lot of time multiple places in the pros. Coached the Rockets for a while before he got the job with the Cougars. Spent time in Indiana, Oklahoma, etc. So he's a guy with a ton of wisdom, very solid X's and O's. He's a coach that gets the most out of his players. For me, there's two reasons why. Actually, probably three reasons why I don't think that Louisville truly even considers him. Number one, and that's the fact that he's 66 years old. I doubt that, when looking for a coach, that Josh Hurd or whoever makes the hire is going to go with the guy that may not necessarily be coaching for all too much longer. I mean, 66 years old. It's not unheard of to see guys coach into their mid-70s, but also you have to wonder, how much of an investment are you putting into Kelvin Sampson just for him to, coach for, 5-6 more years or however many more years he plans on coaching. Number two, and that's the fact that, he loves the city of Houston. I'm not saying that he wouldn't consider the Louisville job, because I think that he would consider it, but with him having coached, being an assistant coach for the Rockets for a handful of seasons and now being with the Cougars since, 2014, I think it's one of those to where he's probably another, kind of in the same boat as Scott Drew, like a thanks but no thanks type of thing. I don't necessarily think that, it would probably be one of those things to where he would, relocate this, deep into his coaching career. It's just one of those things that kind of makes you, kind of shrug your shoulders back. If this was 5 years ago, maybe, et cetera. But the biggest reason is the the NCAA violations throughout his career. Had a handful of violations while he was the head coach of Oklahoma in the late 90s, early 2000s, and then picked up some more violations at Indiana in, I believe it was 2007 or 2008, in the recruitment of Eric Gordon. So I think that, from an optics aspect, I think that Louisville's going to probably make a hire that, you hire a coach that hasn't necessarily had too many blemishes on his record. Take Will Wade, for example. I think Will Wade is one hell of a coach. He's 39 years old. His timeline fits Louisville in terms of what he could bring to the table in terms of stability over a long period of time. But the fact that LSU still has possible recruiting allegations going on and investigation kind of going, it's one of those things where it's like, good coach, just a couple factors that really prevent Louisville from being, being seriously interested. And I think in this case for Kelvin, he might, be necessarily interested, but at this late in his career, having a lot of stability at Houston, being in Houston for, quite some time, and then obviously the recruiting violations on the other end, I'm not necessarily sure how realistic Sampson is or Scott Drew. So both of those guys, they look good on paper in terms of, if they were to become Louisville's next head coach. I mean, you're talking about possible national championship contention in the next couple seasons. But at this point in time, those are two names that should be crossed off of many fans' lists if you still have both of them respectfully on there. Two other guys that would be good are revered as being good coaches, not necessarily good fits. That is the head coach of Oklahoma State and Mike Boynton, and the head coach of BYU and Mark Pope. So we'll go ahead and we will talk about both of those coaches here in the next segment after we talk about our friends at BetOnline. BetOnline has had you covered this season with more props, odds, and lines than ever before. As football continues its march to the playoffs, right to the big game in a couple days, I should say. BetOnline.net remains the best spot for all of your sports scores, podcasts, and news this season. And it's not just football; it has up-to-the-minute info on pro and college hoops, NHL, boxing, UFC, along with live real-time updates of current games. Don't wait to take advantage of all the new amazing offers available for the 2022 season. BetOnline is where the game starts. Thank you once again for making Locked On Louisville your first listen of the day. And just a reminder, today being the NBA trade deadline, at 3 p.m. today, the Locked On NBA podcast will be covering it live from 2 to 4 p.m. Join Kim Becker, John Corrales, and Locked On fantasy basketball host Josh Lloyd to get analysis of every blockbuster move. Subscribe to the Locked On NBA YouTube and turn on your notifications so you know when they go live. Transitioning over into two good coaches that maybe not necessarily the best fits or / hires for the Louisville men's basketball team. That is Oklahoma State head coach Mike Boynton and BYU head coach Mark Pope. We'll start out talking about the former, Mike Boynton, the youngest coach, being talked about today. He's 40 years old, signed or agreed to a contract extension. I think it was later in the spring, a 7-year, $21 million contract. If I'm reading it correctly, the buyout is 75% of his remaining contract, and that goes through the end of 2026-27, but the buyout drops after the 24-25 season, so it is definitely a hefty buyout. That alone probably makes Louisville probably force them to be in the no thanks type of mentality. But overall, Mike Boynton is a coach that when you talk to, I've talked to a couple Oklahoma State fans that I know, and they are, absolutely, they are huge fans of Boynton. They believe he gets the most out of his players. Every game they play hard. They are, struggling this season. The Cowboys are. They're 11-12, although, the Big 12 is, it's brutal. I mean, there's a handful. It's seemingly top to bottom. It's good games every time you step foot on the court. In conference, they do have the postseason ban over I think it was a $300 violation with I think his name was Lamont Evans, the associate head coach back in, I think it's 2017. Now, Oklahoma State got the postseason ban, so some fans were like, well, Mike Boynton, I mean, he's at a program that is now serving a postseason ban. That is true, but all of the reports, all of the findings never associated Boynton with any of the allegations or anything like that, any of the violations. So, there's no blemishes on his resume or coaching record. He's been at the helm at Oklahoma State since 2017-18 after Brad Underwood left for Illinois. Since then, he has had 2 20-win seasons, made the NCAA tournament last season, most notably with 2021 first overall pick Cade Cunningham. This is kind of one of those to where I think he's a good coach. I like, when I watch Oklahoma State, I like the product of basketball that I'm seeing. I think they play hard on both ends of the court. It's a lot of unselfish basketball, a lot of ball movement and stuff like that. The caution that I have with Boynton, number one, is I think that we talked about checking boxes, in terms of this coaching search, right? And I think we speak about there's not a ton of NCAA tournament experience. There's no NCAA experience, head coaching wise for Kenny Payne, but I think there's other boxes like recruiting, like unifying the fan base, being an exciting hire, re-injecting energy into this program. He checks other boxes that kind of overlook the not being a head coach aspect of things. He's one of those guys that Kenny Payne is an exception. But when we talk about some other head coaches, Mike Boynton has made the NCAA tournament once in 4 seasons. In 2019-20, they were 18-14, so it was unlikely that the Cowboys were going to make the tournament that year. So ultimately, they made the tournament with Cade Cunningham, and talking about Mike as a recruiter, it seems like Oklahoma State is continuing to recruit better and better. I will say that having Cade Cunningham's relative on staff, does give the Oklahoma State coaching staff an advantage. So I'd like to see how Mike Boynton continues to recruit. It's one of those things to where if this coaching search was like 3 years down the road and we had a bigger sample size of what Mike Boynton was able to do post Cade Cunningham, I would really like to see where we were at in 3 seasons. But ultimately, I think it would be an uninspiring hire for the fan base. Good coach, good X's and O's coach. I think his energy that he brings to his programs and the way that his players, speak highly of him. I think that it's what this Louisville program truly needs. But ultimately, I think, the recruiting aspect, the lack of NCAA tournament success, and, overall, just the, uninspiring aspect of it. I think it's one of those that make Mike a long shot for the position. Good coach, not necessarily a good fit / hire at this point in time. Another coach that fits that mold is BYU's Mark Pope. He's 49 years old. Now, it was interesting. I did as much digging as I could. I could not find anything that showed how much he was making, although he just signed a contract extension to the end of the 2026-27 season. There was reports that he was going to continue to keep his pay low throughout the pandemic to help other employees. That's a high character move. Ultimately, Pope, most notably, I should say, played his college ball at Kentucky. That's already rubbed some Louisville fans wrong. He coached at Utah Valley for 4 seasons in the WAC. Won over 20 games his past 2 years there. Has been the head coach of BYU for 3 seasons. In 2019-20, they were 24-8, looking as if they were going to make the tournament. Obviously, COVID last year, 20-7, made the NCAA tournament. This year, they're 17-8. So they're probably one of those to where if they lose a couple more games, it could be really interesting. But ultimately, I would expect them to be in the tournament. In terms of the brand of basketball, it's always fun to watch BYU because there's such, like Oklahoma State, there's a very unselfish aspect to the way they play. There's a lot of ball movement. They always shoot the ball really well, it seems like. Yoeli Childs, I remember, watching him develop. Mark Pope is a guy that has a ton of experience, has NBA playing experience. So it's to be said. I think that he's very good at X's and O's. He's good with player development. But like Mike Boynton, there are questions regarding even more so with Mark Pope. How well would he recruit at the Power 5 level? Would he be able to recruit Louisville level guys? Lack of NCAA tournament success. He's only coached in the tournament 1 season. That was last year. And, like Mike Boynton would be, definitely an uninspiring hire for the fan base. So both of these coaches, I think that they're very good X's and O's guys. They bring a ton of stability to their respective programs. They're players, coaches in the way that they get their guys, to buy into the unselfish mentality of, the way they, the way they carry their program. That's not what I'm looking for. Just kind of run their program, I guess you could say. But both right now are not necessarily the right hires for the University of Louisville. It'd be different if it was a couple years in advance to where we would have some sample size, but we are in the current tense, shoulda, coulda, woulda. We will, continue to call, like we said. I don't necessarily think that Boynton or Mark Pope, despite being good coaches, would be truly high up the list in terms of the big board of possible coaches. I want to take this time now to switch gears a little bit. The Louisville softball team begins their 2022 campaign today in Boca Raton. We'll talk about that here in just a second. If you're listening to this audio-wise, you're right now about to listen to a couple messages from a handful of our sponsors. If you're watching on YouTube, you will not see these sponsor messages. So let's get right on into it. The Louisville softball team looks to get back to the NCAA tournament, where in 2019 they pushed the Northwestern Wildcats to the brink of possibly making the getting into the next round of the NCAA tournament. They fell to the nationally seeded Wildcats up in the Chicago area. 2020, obviously, COVID shortened season, no NCAA tournament. Things were not necessarily starting out good for the program. They were 10-13, so struggled a little bit last year. They were 28-1, so missed the tournament, obviously. This upcoming year, looking to get back into the big dance, so to speak. They will begin their season today, as they travel to Boca Raton, Florida for the FAU First Pitch Classic. They'll take on the Owls today in a doubleheader at 4 and 6 p.m. Eastern time, respectively. Tomorrow they'll take on Bethune-Cookman in Indiana, and then they'll conclude their play in the Classic on Saturday morning when they take on Ohio State. So the team is returning a ton of experience, 15 players from last year's team. Most notably is all ACC preseason all ACC selection Carmen Greenwood. Absolutely huge, returning decision for the Cardinals last year. Batted .430, 74 hits, 31 runs. One of the best players, not only in the ACC but the country. Having her at the top of the lineup is, you just can't talk about how important it is. Like it's one of those things to where, it just basically speaks volumes to how good this Louisville hitting attack is going to be this season. Obviously, Taylor Roby's back, the redshirt senior, the Louisville native from Bullitt East High School. The two-way player, very solid pitcher, led the Cardinals last year with a sub-3 ERA. 83 strikeouts in just under 166 total innings. And then obviously she led the team with 14 home runs and 43 RBIs. Both Carmen and Taylor had over 1 OPS. We'll talk about here in just a second why I value OPS a little bit more than batting average. But for the Cardinals, it's a matter of, just getting some improvement in the other, positions in terms of hitting, in terms of pitching. Jennifer Linhart, the grad transfer from Southern Indiana that won a Division II national championship, that was a grad transfer last season. She obviously is no longer with the program, but the Louisville pitching staff returns overall just a ton of the production from last season. We talked about Taylor Roby, what she brings to the circle, but Gabby Holloway, Peyton Hudson, both of those look to take their next steps forward. You also have Chardonnay Harris, who is coming off of an injury that kept her out last season. The lefty will be a huge addition back into the pitching staff. And then you also have some other players, some true freshmen. And, head coach Holly April mentioned on, I think it was Tuesday at Media Day, that Sam Boo is a freshman that she looks to see some meaningful innings here in the circle. So the Cardinal pitching staff returning a lot of experience, and the hitting staff's kind of the same way. Obviously, we talked about Carmen Greenwood and Taylor Roby. You also return infielder Michaela Hurst. Charlie Butler is back. Cassidy Greenwood, Rebecca Chung, so on and so forth. And then you insert transfers from Western Kentucky and Kendall Smith, a transfer from James Madison and Hannah File. So you would expect that this Louisville offense is going to be better than last season, and they will need to get back to the NCAA tournament. Like I mentioned, I value OPS more so than batting average. I think it tells the tale a little bit better when it comes to calculating runs and how a player's at bats are affecting a team's total runs totals and everything like that. obviously, what stands out, Carmen Greenwood, Taylor Roby, and over 1 OPS, which is, I mean, it's absolutely phenomenal. I can't even read that. Okay, yeah, there we go. Michaela Hurst had an over 800 OPS. After that, not necessarily any else over 500, or I'm sorry, over 650. I should say. Charlie Butler had a 636 OPS. That is pertaining to players that met the minimum requirement of 2 plate appearances per game in 75% of the games played. Jenna Cervi, I look for her to take a big step forward this season, etc. One thing I'm interested in terms of seeing is how April is going to, kind of divvy up the playing time behind the plate. Obviously, with softball, you have the designated player. A lot of times that will probably be Taylor Roby when she's not in the circle, just being one of probably the most dynamic hitter on the team. But, you have Cassidy Greenwood, you have Rebecca Chung, Taryn Weddle, who, all saw time, behind the plate last year for Louisville. And now you insert, a player who received multiple All-Conference USA honors and Kendall Smith. It'll be interesting to see how Holly April, divvies up the playing time and gets all of those players at bat. So it's going to be a matter of just, by committee, players just getting, better throughout. And I think that sounds kind of cliche, hey, you got to be better. But I think, the offense last year tells the tale. You have a lot of, impact from Greenwood, from Roby, etc. You have to get some, impact and some production from the other players as well. So ultimately, I'm very excited for this team. I'm going on record and saying that they're going to be back in the NCAA tournament. They have, another schedule that's challenging. The ACC, I think they're projected to finish 6th in a recent poll conducted by, all of the head coaches in the league, etc. There are 4 ACC teams in the top 15 right now. So, I mean, it's going to be a challenging season for the Cardinals. I do think that they take the next step and get back to, into national postseason play here later on in the spring. I'm very excited. I think that, Carmen Greenwood is going to continue to scorch planet Earth. Taylor Roby is going to continue to hit it to the bridge out in center field of Ulmer Stadium. And we're going to see the Cardinals bounce back and get into the national picture once again. But talked about, Scott Drew, Kelvin Sampson, Mark Pope, Mike Boynton, and the softball preview for the season outlook. Tomorrow is going to be, a little bit more of what we've been doing the past couple of days, coaching search talk, etc. Before we get out of here, a couple quick shout-outs. First, to the Cardinal Sports Zone podcast. You can check that out at cardinalsportszone.com. The Locked On Bets podcast, hosted by your boy Q, with handicapping expert analysis from Lee Sterling. You can get that on the Odyssey app or wherever you like to get your podcasts. But that's going to wrap up this Thursday edition of the show. Everyone have a great day as always. We'll see you right back here tomorrow. Go Cards.